is particularly relevant right now because it has some rather significant implications going forward. Clearly, there's a lot of dysfunctionality that's going on in Congress right now. And all I can think of is a quote that I remember from many years ago when I took a college literature class. It's about the only thing I remember from this class, trust me. But Lord Byron, in one of his poems, he used a line, he said, "'Tis strange but true, for truth is always strange, stranger than fiction." Boy, you can look at our political environment today, and that's a particularly appropriate comment because you hear all kinds of comments from everybody about different subjects in that, and many of these comments turn out to be totally untrue in that, and yet they have a significant relevancy in today's environment. So we live in an incredibly politicized environment. You look at all the battles that are going on various policy matters. It doesn't matter whether it has to do with the environment, who serves on various committees. You look at all the battles that took place over the last couple of months. You look at committee assignments and things of that nature. I'm not sure I've ever seen in an environment quite like this. Well, anyway, we have a speaker today who's going to sort all of this out, and I and I hope I'm not setting him up too badly. But anyway, if you have questions, David is willing to take them while he's doing his presentation, and that just raise your hand and I'll get the mic over to you. Anybody who's joining us virtually, if you type in your question in the chat space, that question will be passed along and he'll be more than happy to answer it. Some of you have had a chance to hear Dave before. He's connected with the political science department at Hope. He's been here since 1994. So he has a long tenure here. He's published numerous books and articles on the Supreme Court, the electoral process, religious liberty. He has a lot of expertise in electoral politics. And he's been on such things as CNN. He's been featured in the New York Times. He's been in U.S. News and World Report. So we have a really good person to sort all of these issues out for us. So I'm going to turn it over to him at this point, and I just hope I haven't made things too tough for you, Dave, in terms of answering all these questions that are coming away. The only thing I would hope is we would keep the trash talk down and not make it too difficult on them.
Oh, trash talk is welcome. How's that for sound? Is that good? As a former member of the NBA, that's the Noon Ball Association over at Dow on campus. If you're not familiar with it, there was a lot of trash talk going on, and I was very good at it. If I could have played ball the way I trash talked, I might have been playing D1 or something. But thanks, Robert. Yes, for that introduction and that preview, most of which I probably won't even talk about. I have my own agenda, largely electoral politics, kind of parsing the 2022 elections and hopefully having a little bit of time to think about what it all means for our party system, of which I'm a big fan, and the current iteration of which I'm extremely concerned. That I think the dysfunction runs quite deep. I titled this the status quo election, a postmortem on the 2022 elections. And I got up this morning, I reviewed the title I'd given it, and I said, I don't like that title. So I was kind of fishing around for some alternative titles. One possibility was the pox on both your houses election. And if you've heard me talk before, I have described myself as a pox on both your houses person. And it just seems really appropriate from my elevated perch of moral superiority over both Democrats and Republicans. But no, I won't go with that. And a second one, and I forget where I read this, and I really liked it, but I can't remember who the author of it was. So I apologize. I want to make it clear this is not a Ryden original, but I'm I am plagiarizing it. And whoever this was described this election season as a choice for voters to give power to, on the one hand, the out of touch party, or on the other hand, to the out of their minds party. The Dems being the first, the Republicans being the latter. That seems to make sense to me. And when given that choice, unsurprisingly, the voters did neither, right? And they gave us a resounding split decision. But I will stick with the status quo election and describe it this way in terms of sort of an overarching take. So you know where I'm coming from before we kind of wade into some of the details. A status quo election can be, I think, interpreted or understood in two ways. And one possible interpretation is election that reflects a general degree of contentedness on the part of the voters. There's something for each party to hang on to, silver linings, things they're doing right. And the status quo suggests we can continue on with business as usual. That's option one. The second interpretation, which I prefer, is one that can be only understood as a negative judgment on the choices and hence an unwillingness on the part of the voters to give either party a clear vote of confidence. In this view, both parties, if they were healthy, if they were responsive, if they were rational, and act like parties are supposed to, which is be motivated by the desire to win elections, they would come out of this election severely chastened, engaging in serious, deep soul searching, and would be sort of slinking back to their corners to figure out what they need to do differently. I'm not seeing much of that, actually, from either party. And I think that's a problem. So that's the big take. Okay, on what I have to say. I've given you the outline, so we are going to see how far we get. We're going till 4, right, Robert? Why do I only have one session in an hour and a half? I mean, good golly, I'm a lawyer and an academic. That's an unreasonable expectation. But let's go, giddy up. Please, yes, at any time, raise your hands, jump in. Like I will try to periodically stop for comments and questions. Let's not save them for the end. If we get through a third of the outline, fabulous. I'm doing better than I normally do. Okay, so please don't. I love HAS because you are fun, you are engaged, you're well informed. I know I have some people who lean in different directions and maybe have a different letter by their name, R versus D. My goal is sort of to see if I can say something that will rile everybody up in the room. That's kind of my goal. All right. So let's start real quickly. Sort of the first bullet point is to, just kind of let's recap kind of what came out of election day. Okay. Kind of a quick summary of the results. So in the US Senate going in 50-50 split, even split, right? The Democrats have Vice President Harris as the president pro tem to break the ties. Coming out of election day, the Democrats pick up one. And so they currently have a 51-49 margin. House of Representatives going in, the Democrats have one of the narrowest majorities, thinnest majorities in the history of the House, 23 to 212. Coming out, Republicans pick up 10, Democrats lose 10. It's basically flipped. Now the Republicans have essentially the narrowest majority margin in history. At the gubernatorial level, in the governor's mansions, Democrats pick up 2 governor's seats. And we are left with Republicans, 26 Republican governors, 24 Democratic governors. At the state legislative level, which we ought not to ignore in an era of congressional dysfunction, paralysis, power flows down. And so what happens at the state level matters and matters a lot. And as someone who increasingly thinks in localist terms, even when we have wild and crazy developments like Ottawa impact going on, I still think that the politics to which we are closest bears giving it our attention, and what happens at the state and local level is important. At the state level, Democrats across the country picked up 4 chambers, 2 of those being in our home state of Michigan. And so Republicans at this stage, Republicans have full control of both houses of the legislatures in 27 states, Democrats in 19, and with the remainder split. The trifecta, which is, yes, it's a bet on the ponies, but it's also refers to states where the same party controls both the governor's mansion and both chambers of Congress. Republicans have the trifecta in 22 states. Democrats have it in 17 states. An interesting little way of looking at that differently. If you look at the populations who are controlled by the 22 versus the 20 versus the 17 Democratic states are something like 140 million people. The Republican 22 states, something like 131 million. So that's kind of a different perspective. A really interesting little side note. That's not a side note. This is an extremely interesting development, is the popular vote across the country as measured by votes for congressional candidates in the 435 districts. Okay. Republicans with a 3 million vote advantage over Democrats. Republicans taking about 54.5 million votes to the Democrats 51.5 million. A flip of about 7 points, I think, since the last election cycle. That's interesting. That's important to a lot of the narratives that we have, right? For quite a while now, the narrative has been structural advantages for the Republicans. And so the Electoral College has a built-in edge for the Republicans, right? Other elections, the Senate elections, built-in advantage for the Republicans, and they can get a minority of the vote across the country and end up with majorities in the House. So for Democrats, this has been a driving narrative. This has driven calls for reforms, calls for abandoning the Electoral College and going with a nationwide popular vote. This might cause us to think twice about that. If you're someone with a D by your name, does this mean in future presidential elections that the popular vote may sort of tip the other way, right? 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections, Democrats have won the popular vote. This is a really interesting development, and we'll kind of see what comes of that. So that's the recap. Where does that leave us with? That leaves us with a country that is closely divided, like historically closely divided. Okay, certainly the balance, the parity is beyond anything I've witnessed in my lifetime since I've been a student of politics. Right? At the gubernatorial level, Republicans, 52%. At the Senate level, Democrats, 51%. At the House level, Republicans, 51%. Right? State legislatures, what not very long ago was Republican dominance, like a fairly drastic shrinking of that gap, that we are in an unparalleled era of parity, of competition. I would like to say this is because both parties are doing so well that they are right there at about 50%. I think it's something quite different than that, actually. And if you think back and trace the arc of congressional elections from the Gingrich Revolution in 1994, when Republicans took control of the House for the first time in 40 years, we have had 30 years of ping-ponging back and forth, volatility in the control of the House. And that is attributable much more to a general level of dissatisfaction than it is the out party doing such a good job, making themselves so compelling and attractive that majorities have no choice but to vote for them. This evenness is really significant, I think, in a time when we have the level of polarization that we have. So that's a really kind of interesting factor. Why do I take this pox on both of your houses kind of view of things? If you look at some data, I think this election can only be viewed as a negative referendum on both parties. Exit poll data, which is generally pretty good. It's the kind of data I actually think is worthwhile when it comes to surveys around elections. Exit data gave the Republican Party as a party a negative rating of 9 points. The Democrats, I think it was 10 points. So the general perceptions of the parties as people are coming out of the voting booths, having just cast their votes, is pretty darn negative. Typically in a midterm election, especially in the midterm, that is the first midterm faced by a newly elected president. Overwhelmingly, historically, right, the pattern is the president in his first midterm usually gets kicked in the shorts, but good. Right, overwhelmingly, the president's party loses lots of seats. The midterm is viewed as a referendum on the new sitting president, and typically it's not good. Okay, so what happened here? I would argue there's sort of the unique facet of this election was that there were not one but two presidents on the ballot. Neither one technically on the ballot, but both on the ballot in the sense that the votes on the House members and senators and state legislators were proxies for how people feel about the sitting president, Mr. Biden, and the former president, Mr. Trump. And both of those were exceedingly negative. So again, turning to the exit polls, I think it was about a third of Republican voters, when asked what motivated their vote, a third of them said it was pure and simple, a vote against President Biden. It was not an affirmative vote for anything the party stood for. It was not a positive vote. It was a negative vote on Biden. Democrats asked the same question, same answer, about the same margin. About a third of them that said we are voting against President Trump. That's kind of remarkable. A former president who's been ousted, that's who they're voting against, right? And so, and the more former President Trump inserted himself into the picture, or into the consciousness of the voters as the election drew near, he thought things were going to go swimmingly with the Republicans. Of course, he wanted to take credit for it. So he was more and more visible, right? The more voters are going to be reminded of, yeah, we don't want that. And it's like, this party is his party. So, and we can talk more about both of those figures as we hopefully can talk a little bit about 2024 and what this portends for the presidential election. All right, let me get into a little dissection of the election and how I understand it, and then I will pause and see if there are some comments or questions. I tend to look at this election as a contest between an issue agenda, an issue landscape that favored one party, and a general sense based on the quality of candidates and how people perceived the party to which those candidates belonged on the other hand. Okay, and the more it was a sort of an issue landscape, the more it favored Republicans. And the more it was about candidate quality, the more people sort of negatively judged the party to which those crazy candidates belonged. And that was the contest, okay? So on the issue landscape, and always taking with a grain of salt, right, kind of claims about just how issue-oriented people and voters are. We take that with a grain of salt. And yet this was a midterm where I think issues actually sort of penetrated the voters' general kind of lack of interest in particulars. And there were issues kind of in the air, right? And those favored Republicans to a remarkable degree. So surveys that showed what are the top half dozen issues about which voters care. Okay, so it's to prioritize the issue. And then the follow-up question, and is which party do you trust more to deal with that issue in a responsible way? And with the exception of abortion, right? With the exception of abortion, the top issues all tilted in a Republican direction. The economy, right? Inflation and gas prices, energy policy. So Democrats love climate change legislation. Non-Democrats, centrists, and Republicans hate the energy policy that comes from that climate change legislation. So more broadly, right, energy policy tilted in a Republican direction. Crime. Lots of concern about crime elevated in urban areas with the onset of progressive prosecutors and the like. Majorities of voters trusted Republicans. Education for crying out loud, right? What has been the most reliable issue for Democrats for as long as we've all paid any attention to politics? Education. Not this time. Right? Not this time. And you saw it in kind of grassroots parents, not just conservative parents, but parents in well-to-do suburban districts and school boards outside of Washington, D.C., showing up to protest and complain about things where they just saw the school districts really going in the ditch, right, on some of these hot button social issues. Immigration. And the sense of what was going on at the border, especially on the southern border, really reflected a lack of control on the part of the administration. And things like fentanyl and other things that kind of associated with that, right? You look at that, that is an issue agenda that favored the Republican Party, okay, in a big way. And you could see it in like Joe Biden's approval ratings, which could never get higher than kind of low 40s. You see it in the right path, wrong path surveys that the surveyors are always doing, right? Asking people, are we on the right track? Are we on the wrong track? 75% saying we're on the wrong track, right? All that giving a sense that if you think about the substance of policy and policy debates, the out party was in a pretty good position. Right. And hence the anticipating a red wave, a big red tsunami that was going to sweep out Democrats en masse and bring in Republicans. Before we get to the candidate quality, just a little bit on the abortion issue, right, which is a really interesting one and really a complicated, a much more complicated an issue than I think the pundits and the journalists and the surveyors tended to really capture. Okay, on the one hand, it was undeniably a positive for Democrats in particular places. In certain, so I would argue, is state specific, race specific, and in those places where it was a positive, especially in a place like Michigan, where two things. It was right. You had an incumbent governor, who's quite an artful politician, and it's accompanied, and she's going against a challenger who, to be diplomatic, was an inartful politician, right? How she talked about abortion was ham-handed and just bad. And you had a ballot initiative. And right, and ballot initiatives can be really a strategic way of ginning up turnout and support. And Michigan was an example of a place where that happened. And it happened in a number of other states around the country. It was state specific, right? So you could go to other states where you had the state legislatures and the governor signing off on really pretty strict abortion regulations. But these were governors who were confident how they talked about kind of the pro-life side of things, and they passed the legislation and they moved on. And so in Florida, right, you had DeSantis doing that and winning by 20 points. In Iowa, Governor DeWine, same thing. What did I say? Oh, no, not Iowa. Ohio. Yes, thank you. As a Minnesotan, yeah, that's Ohio, East, Iowa, South. Yeah. Mike DeWine in Ohio. Thank you very much. Yes, the older I get, the more like this is not tracking this. Who else? Texas, obviously, Governor Abbott and a Texas law that was quite strict, right? And they didn't pay the price. In fact, they won handily. And so lots of interesting things going on there about what's the nature of the state and the electorate, the politicians and how well or poorly they articulate their positions. I think a lot of Republican candidates were like just bad in how they talked about it. Right. And after decades of just being able to sort of offer banalities on Roe v. Wade, lo and behold, Roe v. Wade is gone and they have to actually articulate a compelling argument. And many of them, most of them were really bad at it. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see, like, let's keep an eye on this issue going forward. And I honestly don't know if this is something that will be sort of a arrow in the Democratic quiver that they can use for subsequent election cycles, or as Republicans get more artful, this maybe settles out some, or it just gets resolved and maybe lessens in salience. Although I don't know. When has abortion ever lessened in salience? The debate about it, not since 1973. So we'll see. That's a really interesting one to keep an eye on. All right, I need to get some water, catch my breath. Have I gotten anyone exercised yet? Questions, comments? Let's take a couple if you've got them. If you want, otherwise I can repeat either one.
Education tended to favor Republicans this time. I wrote down the word masks, wokeness, and trans bathrooms. I have a hard time believing the majority of voters are on that side on those things, and that yet it seemed to prevail.
Ooh. So the question was on education, Republicans prevailing. The three things you mentioned, make sure I get them: masking, trans bathrooms, wokeness, which I would translate into critical race theory, or whatever you want to call the public education facsimile thereof. You suggested it's hard to believe voters are on that side. I think the evidence shows otherwise. That I think voters really want kind of common sense, right? So take DeSantis's "don't say gay" bill, as the journalist characterized it, right? Which in Florida was a state law saying public schools will not kind of expose students to questions of trans and sexuality beneath third grade or first grade. I forget what. Third grade. Run past the public, overwhelming support for that bill. Right. That's not how it was characterized in the media, because the media is going to take a more left position on that kind of issue. Oh, I mean, this is why DeSantis, for you Democrats, be concerned. Like he's clever. Right. Race issues. I mean, I think we have gone from a position where we sort of assumed DEI was a good thing, that happening in public schools was a good thing. Now it's really contested. And I think that will continue to be, that there is, right? You saw it in Florida, again, on the question of an African-American history studies program. And, right, there's teaching Black history, right? And then there's kind of something more where parents are sensing kind of ideology creeping in. And then it's much more kind of an anti-racism agenda. That's not history. So I think that one's more contested. On trans issues, yeah, I don't think bathrooms are a big issue. As a dad who has a couple high school girls who are swimmers, maybe my view is distorted by my own personal interest in wanting fairness for my girls as competitors, as athletes who have done club swimming since they were 6 years old. So I think on that issue, I think there's a fairly widespread sense that we've kind of left the realm of reason, and we don't want sort of ideology and sort of propagandizing going on in schools. I don't know. But I will not claim to say I've done a deep dive into kind of public opinion surveys. I don't know. I mean, you're kind of taking a different view. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think Dems have kind of sacrificed kind of the high ground. Because these are issues, it's like on a lot of these school board meetings, like it is not just conservatives showing up at these school board meetings. So for example, I don't know if anybody has followed the story out of Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia. It is regarded year in and year out as the best, the highest quality high school in the country. I don't know how you determine that, but they come there. A good friend of mine graduated from there a number of years ago, right? National Merit Scholarships. The story comes out recently that a number of their National Merit Scholars, the school withheld notifying those National Merit Scholars because they were Asian. And because you didn't have sort of the proper kind of racial and ethnic balance. When you start kind of seeing those kinds of, right, and those are the kind of stories that sort of catch the news and they may catch the attention. And those are the kinds of stories that I think can tilt kind of general public, right, kind of public attitudes on these things. But I do think education is up for grabs. I mean, it's just like education is so important to so many people. And I think, right, conservative or liberal bona fides tend to fall away a little bit when parents they want what's best for their kids. But I could very easily see the Republicans kind of mishandling that until the Dems regain the upper hand. We'll see. We'll see. But it's a good question. Maybe one more before we move on. Yeah, Mark.
So there are more things that are addressing gerrymandering, include more and more states in our country that are addressing gerrymandering,
yes,
including our own. And I'm wondering if I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, which party is going to be more concerned about that in the future? And how do you see this play out?
Good question, Mr. DeRue. I'm going to make a public apology in your presence. You were quite involved in the Let Voters Vote, or what was it called? Voters, not politicians. And there was a case of me just knowing too much, just thinking I am an expert and actually know, right? I was skeptical about how it was crafted. I love taking the idea out of the hands of the politicians. I thought it was seriously flawed in some of the criteria for people who would serve. I thought there was an animus towards politics, rightly understood, that it's like, oh, this, in some way, these people are going to know so little, they're going to have to rely on experts who will then find ways to do their politicking, right, in another way. So I didn't have great expectations and I was wrong, right? I think it turned out pretty darn good for Michigan. I think we had competition. We had more districts that were competitive. So kudos. Yep. You had the wisdom. You entered the cave where I was toiling in darkness, and you brought light to me. So thank you. This is a fascinating story of this election cycle, is redistricting. So, right, it's 2020, the census every 10 years. And then after the census, right, you're going to have reapportionment, that is moving seats from state to state, depending on in and out migration and shifts of population. And then based on that, you have redistricting in every state, whether they gain or lost states, right? There's changes in the state and where people live. So it's the redistricting. Reapportionment is the reapportioning of seats between states to kind of reflect population changes, okay? Out of that comes redistricting, which is the redrawing of the lines within a state. The congressional district lines, the state legislative lines, that's redistricting, right? An inherently political task, which is why popular reforms now are to take it out of the hands of the politicians. So we fully expected that this was going to be hurly-burly, smackdown politics, and that one party in particular would be able to use it to their advantage. Which party? Why? No, they've all done it before. They're all pros. No, it's just they had more opportunity, right? Because they just had more states. that because of the Republican dominance at the state level, they just had a lot more opportunity. Oh, believe me, this is equal opportunity abuse of power, right? If you've got the power, you're going to do it, whether you've got a D or an R beside your name, right? But people expected, Sean Trendy, who's a guy I know a little bit and one of my favorite prognosticators. He's a social scientist. He actually knows like very granular understanding of politics and elections. And he thought it would be sort of a net 10, 12 seats that would sort of give Republicans an extra kind of 10 to 12 seats just through kind of the redistricting advantage. Nada. It pretty much ended up a wash. Okay, through some districting reforms, that was a part of it. A second part of it was through state legislatures who were so ham-handed, who just overplayed their hands so badly that their state courts and their state Supreme Court had no choice but to toss the results out and stick their own plan in. Okay. And so Republicans did that in a number of states and they just lost the edge. In several other states, Democrats, okay, they're pretty good at this. Okay. So Illinois, right? Probably the Democratic Party, Illinois, they were the gold standard this time around for working the process to maximize their seats. Okay. What's the opposite of the gold standard? The what? The turd standard. Let's come. No, that's crass, but I'm sorry. The turd standard was New York, actually. And because we're in New York, complete Democratic control of the levers of power in the state. And they totally overplayed their hand. It was so bad, that a Democratic appointed state Supreme Court tossed it out, plugged their own in. New York was one of the rare bright spots for the Republican Party. They actually flipped 3 or 4 seats from Democratic to Republican. So all this is happening across the country. And it was sort of a wash. So you asked, Mark, like who ought to be more worried moving forward? Well, the good news is we've got 10 years before it happens again. Like, no, really. And so normally, even when there's it has a big impact, right? The further removed you are from the recycling election, right? The impact tapers and it diminishes and it gradually dissipates. And we're kind of starting from a point where there's not much there. So I think for the next 10 years, we're in pretty good shape. So, I'm good. I'm not good enough to anticipate what's going to happen 10 years down the road. So I won't do that. That's a great question though. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. A couple sort of trends, developments in this election cycle, returning to the outline. Yes, very good. We are up to number 5. Killing it. I'm doing well. When you live with 3 teenage girls, you get good at kind of complimenting yourself, giving yourself a pat on the back. So I like to do that because nobody else does it for me in my life. So noteworthy trends. And this I described as the continuation of the rolling realignment that has been going on for the last decade or more. Okay, this is a realignment around the issues of class, wealth, education, and geography. Okay. And we are seeing a remaking of the political parties. It's been going, the Obama administration was probably when it really started becoming more perceptible. Okay. And you had the party of the ascendant, which was the Democratic coalition, and you had the party or the coalition of the preservationist. Right. And so the ascendant, right. And this was the well-educated, the wealthy, the urban cosmopolitans, the young, the minorities. And this was a coalition that was on the rise. Right. And over in the sort of the protectionist or preservationist coalition, you had old people and there were white people and they lived in rural settings that were dying. Okay, and so this was and there were books written about the permanent Democratic majority. right? And then in about 2010 and following, we started to see changes and alterations to those sort of competing coalitions. Okay, and it happened around class and wealth. Okay, so that we now have a Democratic Party that is not, decidedly not the party of the little guy. Right? To the extent they represent unions, it's public unions, and those are not the poor working class folks. Right? Private unions have essentially gone away. Okay. Now union leadership still fully in the Democratic camp, teachers unions, public employees unions, right? But there has been this working class shift in the Republican direction. The Republican increasingly, now they're still, right? I'm sweeping with, painting with broad strokes, right? So, but there has been a significant kind of change and shift in working class voters to the Republican side, the well-to-do in the Democratic direction. If I were a tech guy, or if I weren't lazy, I would find you a visual graphic that shows precinct by precinct, county by county. Two things: wealth, average family income, and whether they vote red or blue. It'll knock your socks off. Like overwhelmingly, the wealthiest districts are all Democrat. Poor districts, all Republican. It is striking. If you go ask the Google, you could sort of find this, and it's really amazing. So it's happening around class and wealth. Relatedly, it's happening around, what was I going to say? Education, right? So increasingly, the better educated gravitate to the Democratic Party, the less educated gravitate to the Republican Party. Okay, and finally, geography. And there is this geographic sorting out. Okay, so when I mentioned that Republicans, right, Republicans won the popular vote in terms of congressional voting by 3 million. That's a matter of the sorting, the geographic sorting out. Okay, so for the longest time, Michigan is always an interesting example. For the longest time, you can think in terms of efficiency of the vote and how efficient is the Democratic vote versus the Republican vote. And that's basically a fancy way of saying, how many seats do you get out of this percentage of voters? And the Democrats have traditionally, like in the last couple of decades, last generation, really inefficient. Why? Because they all live in urban areas, they're heavily concentrated, and they're overwhelmingly Democratic, right? So if you were to, like 10 years ago, you go look at all the congressional districts in Michigan, and the Republicans would win by 60-40, 55-45, 65-35. You go look at all the Democratic winners, 85-15, 81-19. That's called an inefficient vote. Okay, my theory is that the Republicans are now equally inefficient because we are sorting things out by geography. And increasingly, and if you stay up, you're like I do, you stay up way too late watching the chuckleheads with their maps, right? And they're going county by county and precinct by precinct, and they're looking at all the votes come in, and they're talking about this rural area, and it is deep, deep, deep red. Right. And then you look at all the urban areas and it's deep, deep, deep blue. And then it's a little lighter blue or red in those suburban areas that are more up for grabs. And this is a part of the great sorting out in this country along race, not along race, I take that back. Shame on me, because this is how it often gets characterized, is being about race. Right. So one of the big storylines, if I am a Democratic consultant, there is one development that's like it doesn't keep me up. I fall asleep, I wake up at 2, and thinking about this doesn't let me get back to sleep. And that is the Hispanic vote. Right. And the Hispanic vote this time, something like 40% in a Republican direction, compared to, I think 2018 was something like 26%. So in 4 years, like that's not insubstantial. And if you look at someone like DeSantis, he's kind of got the magic sauce. He goes into Dade County, which Republicans haven't won in a bazillion years. He wins it, Okay, he wins a majority of the Hispanic vote in the state, which is granted, it's a unique Hispanic vote. But then you go to Abbott in Texas, he didn't win a majority, but pretty darn close. Right? In Ohio, you look at the Republican governor doing very well with Hispanic voters. They are up for grabs. Okay. And that's not a matter of race or ethnicity. I would argue that's a matter of sort of values, and are they feeling kind of more along the sort of the traditional lines of the Republican Party than the Democratic Party? They're less educated. They tend to be, many are in kind of more rural places. And those are the kinds of things that are feeding this realignment. And by a rolling realignment, it's happening over time, right? So I said it kind of started with the Obama administration, right? Trump comes along and he puts that development on steroids, kicks it into overdrive. There is a book called The Great Revolt. And I've used it a couple of times in my election class because it is like surveys and interviews, and it creates these profiles of those groups, those different categories of voters who put Donald Trump in the White House. And these are the voters in all these key swing areas in swing states that he won in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Iowa. And it is all about these kinds of things we're talking about, a completely different and very kind of working class kind of coalition, right? That continued in this election cycle. That continued. So I don't know. I mean, if I'm a Democrat, I am looking for ways to do something about this. Because this is the largest, that's the fastest growing demographic, Hispanics in terms of turnout. They've always been kind of low there, right? What happens when they start kind of ginning up their turnout? This is a really fascinating element of the story. The other thing is sort of as a part of this geographic sorting out is kind of in and out migration from state to state. And this has gotten some attention, but this is a part of that story. So I went back and looked, right? And so since 1990, so 30 years, Texas, Florida, and Arizona in the apportionment process have picked up 16 seats. Okay, those three states. New York, California, Illinois have lost 13. Okay, so that's that migration and right, this past few years, the state with the highest out migration. Nope. California. State with the biggest in migration, two of them, Texas and Florida. Yep. So that, right, when we think about, now my guess is those are conservatives living in liberal states, and they want to go to states that are, right, the tax burden is more to their liking and the policies, and right, these states are different, right? That's federalism, by golly. But that is feeding this geographic sorting out. And to me, it's a really interesting thing. It's it's kind of troubling because it makes me worry about the degree of polarization and whether we can do anything about that. All right. Any thoughts, any questions? Scott. So I didn't mean to skip you, but I do want to give a couple others a chance. Yep.
I've got, excuse me, two questions from online. First one on the topic of geography. Is there any evidence of a shift of kind of the efficiency of a vote as people through remote work can move from a city to a more rural area, but maybe bring more progressive city views with them?
I'm sure there is. Yeah, I don't know what it is. I mean, but I'm sure it's happening. I think that's going to take a little while to kind of play out. But that's, yeah. So what happened, in the throes of the pandemic at its worst, right? You had people in New York City who, right, they fled. And they went to places that arguably had more conservative politics, right? And so, like, if people from California, if they can do remote work, they don't want to live in LA. Yeah, maybe they move to Austin, right? A good liberal, right, kind of refuge within quite a conservative state. Will that be enough to alter the politics of a place? I think you would have to be a state that is quite, right, fairly even, because if it's going to be a state that is, right, for the longest time, Texas, people were thinking, oh, Texas, the Republican, margin over the Democrats is shrinking and shrinking. We are on our way towards becoming a Democratic state, especially given how people thought about Hispanic voters, there being a heavily Hispanic vote. That has leveled out. Arguably, it's going back the opposite direction. I don't see enough Democrats who are leaving the big city to go to a funky place like Austin to alter that. It might change the congressional district here or there, but it would take a very close state. Georgia and Atlanta, that might be an example of a place where you could see a tilt, right? Georgia is so closely divided, it seems. Otherwise, yeah, it's a phenomenon. I don't know how big a phenomenon it is.
Second question from online and the last one from online. Can you give your thoughts on the election of George Santos of New York? Should the House toss him out? When you're online, you can be a little more bold, I think, in speaking up.
You don't want to know my thoughts. I know people in this audience. I have to watch what I say. It is on some level, I guess you got to give him grudging respect for doing this. But good golly, McCarthy kicked the guy to the curb. And, this in the long run is not going to benefit Republicans, right? He somehow thinks we have such a small margin. We have to keep this guy in the House. What a travesty. This is a black mark on our politics. That's all I can say. I think he'll be gone before long. I'm trusting. I have faith. Yeah, it's what a story. Yeah, one more and then we'll get here. Yeah, one more behind. Scott, did you have one more or no? Okay, yeah.
We're looking at the maps, rural versus urban.
Yeah,
seem to be much more prevalent in the South. You look at Georgia, 3 red dots against the rest of the green state. Louisiana, 3 red dots. Arkansas, 2 red dots. There's seems to be a much bigger divide of rural versus urban in the South than there does in, especially the Northeast.
maybe in the Northeast, not in the heartland, right? So I'm from Minnesota. You got the Twin Cities, and then you got everywhere else, right? So my little hometown, Moose Lake, give it up for Moose Lake. Moose Lake, Minnesota, where all the men are. All I know is all the children are good looking, something like that, above average. Up near Duluth, just south of Duluth, when I was in high school and college, God rest his soul, Walter Mondale, when he won one state, it was Minnesota. And the most democratic district was my district in northern Minnesota. Had the Iron Range, Minnesota's answer to the Yoopers. Right. And it was union country. It was mining. It was true blue Democratic. That seat is now a reliable Republican district. It just is. Right. And that is a part of this sort of reshaping geographically. Iowa doesn't really have urban centers. Right. But to the extent you've got Des Moines and Ames, right? The rest of that state is increasingly Republican. And so I think more in the heartland, I think it's going on. I think the Northeast is just sort of reliably Democratic. Things aren't going to change. Same with the Pacific Northwest, right? They're their kind of own unique geographies. Yeah. Wisconsin, the same thing, right? You still have, you got Milwaukee and Madison, but boy, the outstate, it's become a true swing state, right? It is a toss up there. Yeah.
You mentioned briefly that age is one of the divides, and that the young tend to lean toward the Democratic Party. does that indicate that over time, as the older generation passes away and the younger generation increases, that that's going to be a Democratic edge? Or does that mean that when these youngsters who are liberal get older, they start switching to Republican?
What have your experiences been? More liberal. That's always traditionally kind of been the understanding. The young are always more liberal. They're idealistic, right? They think government, they have like a unreasonable faith in government to do all things and to do it well. And then lo and behold, we grow up and we know that's like ridiculous. Sorry. There, did I get somebody riled up on that? No, but there's with time, right? You grow up, you get married, you have kids. There's sort of like that has kind of a more, for many people, that tends to make them kind of gradually more conservative, just as you go through life. I'm not sure now. I mean, there's a level of liberal commitment to young people that seems kind of unshakable. And the Republican Party has made itself so unattractive to young people, I think. So I don't know if that will happen. On the flip side, young voters are fickle. And so typically, yeah, they're more liberal, but then like you get a Ronald Reagan who came along and he attracted young people. He attracted young voters, right? George W. Bush and his compassionate conservatism, he did well with young people. So it's really true that they're more liberal until it isn't. And that oftentimes is going to depend on kind of figures, right? We are so presidentially sort of centered on our politics that kind of a particular presidential candidate can just alter the dynamic, the voting demographics, the partisan balance, all these things. So time will tell. How did I really avoided taking a stand on that one? That's a good question, but it's not to me I could see young people, yeah, being more liberal for longer, but who knows? I can't polish off my crystal ball. All right. Okay, moving on. Random observations. Nah, I want to move over that. We don't have that much time. So the state of our democracy, because I do want to emphasize here, I want to have some good news. I want to be upbeat about something. And here I will say this election cycle, I think, gave us good news on the health and the vibrancy of our electoral structures and our electoral systems. Right. And there was so much moaning and gnashing of teeth and waiting for the sky to fall. And it never did. Okay. And in fact, I would suggest that this was kind of a strikingly normal election in terms of how the structures and the processes and the institutions of elections worked. And I've I'll pat myself on the back again. I've never really quite bought in we have an existential threat to our democracy. I've always, and maybe it's because this is my idealistic side, that no, our institutions and the people who inhabit them are pretty resilient, pretty strong, pretty well kind of conditioned and steeped in sort of democratic fundamentals. And at least through this election cycle, I think I'm right. I think this sort of bolsters my take on things. Not a lot of questions, not a lot of controversies. One exception being the state of Arizona and how they count votes. So even when, part of it is the Kerry Lakes of the world who are cray-cray, part of it is they have bad ways of counting votes that take way too long. This is not rocket science. Change the darn rules, get the votes counted, right? The longer time you have, the more sort of room for mischief. For the Kerry Lakes of the world to make mischief. So there are some pockets like that. But by and large, I think things went really well. I think there was a flat out rejection of those candidates who tried to make their hay by relitigating the 2020 election, by who are looking back and trying to, right, kind of say Trump's victory was stolen and this sort of thing. That, Trump's endorsement of those candidates oftentimes was enough to get them the nomination, and then, right, they would get drummed out of the general election. That take had no lasting power, especially where there are independents, moderates of both parties, suburban America. I just think anybody who wants to double down on those elections, those kind of election claims, I don't think is going to do well. I just think increasingly people are really tired of it. And even like Republicans, a lot of Republicans are tired of it. And so I feel pretty good about that. Okay. A couple caveats to that. Okay, I mentioned Kerry Lake in Arizona. I mentioned the primaries where Trump did have some sway. I also don't want to suggest that we couldn't go in the ditch in the future, right? We could be one razor close election away from Armageddon. So on that happy note, let's move on. Turnout, another reason for optimism. We are clearly in an era of fairly robust political participation. Okay, 48%, I think, is sort of the last figure I saw that almost equaled 2018's 49%. Right, not very long ago, that's what we were getting, right? Do you all remember Bob Dole and Bill Clinton under 50% for a presidential election, right? Not that long ago. And so I think, we have pandemic era rules that probably for the most part are kind of permanent. They're kind of here to stay. And within reason, I think that's a good thing. Although if I were to wave my magic wand, I might alter some of those. But those rules are here to stay. Now, one party has been much more deft at using those rules to its advantage than the other party. And Democrats, right, they are doing well with early voting, no excuse absentee balloting, mail-in voting and that sort of thing. Republicans, again, in 2022, one more evidence of the toxic impact of sort of Trump and his tics. Which is slamming those early modes of voting, claiming these are opportunities for fraud. And in the process, what is he is telling Republicans not to vote early, not to vote for mail, not to do absentee ballots. Guess what? So guess what Democrats can do when they do this? They can ballot harvest, and they do, right? I don't like it, but they do it. And that's a given. And the other side should do it too. So Republicans, if they want to be competitive in some places, they need to put that Trumpian kind of fear of fraud away and learn from the other party how to use the new rules, because we're largely in kind of an era of new ways of voting. Someone had a hand and I ignored it. Yes. What it was. I do that in class. Students raise their hands. I just keep talking and I will filibuster. And then I was like, because I always try to come back, and invariably it's like, I can't remember. Yeah,
so my question was related to the state of our democracy, largely good news. How would you factor the increase in political violence into your assessment of largely good news?
Political violence. I don't see it as a serious widespread problem. I think there are stories, there are individual events. I'm thinking of the performance of the institutions in a mass democracy, i.e. 330 million people over 50 states at the federal, state, and local levels voting. In light of that, so can you identify, how seriously you think it is? And maybe I'm kind of dismissing or not thinking of some particular stories. We've had a couple that have grabbed headlines, but go ahead.
Well, I guess one thing I would point to is, and I can't quote the exact statistic, but my impression is that in interviews and polls of clerks around just the state of Michigan, an incredibly large percentage of them have indicated that they have received threats, their family have received threats on their lives, all of
Gotcha.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, so you maybe know more than I do. Yeah, and maybe that's, I don't see it playing out in sort of the performance of our democracy. I did have, because I talked about, right, my faith in our democratic structures and institutions. And I did wonder after 2020 that, you know, there were moments of doubt when, as you would see, right, kind of MAGA efforts to grab the levers of local kind of electoral offices where the nuts and bolts stuff of elections happens. And I did wonder if that is something that could kind of undermine the practice of democracy. I don't think it did. Yeah, that's not good. That's obviously bad. I wouldn't equate that with, that's one thing, right? We don't want, you know, believe me, local county clerks or election clerks. Yeah, the rewards are few enough. They don't need to be rewarded with threats of physical harm. So that's, I don't know the magnitude of it. So I will plead ignorance. I would not equate that with animated protest and political activity at the local level, which I by and large see as a really healthy sign of our democracy. People are actually starting to pay attention to local politics. And so I think that's a good thing. So yeah, that's kind of about, that's sort of that's an inadequate answer, I understand. So I will plead ignorance. Somebody else had a, yeah.
There, as I understand it, there is a Supreme Court case that's pending right now that concerns the issue of independent state legislative theory.
Yes.
And I understand that this could really affect elections if the Supreme Court upholds this theory. And given it would allow the state legislatures to really appoint the electoral people, and our vote for president, for example, could become nothing more than an advisory vote.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you talk about
Yes,
that?
I will step lightly here. I've not taken a close look at the case. I haven't really dug into it. I think how you view this one a lot of times really depends on where you sit. So I have read kind of fairly objective legal minds who I respect, who describe this case as the most mischaracterized Supreme Court case in an awful long time. Okay. I think this one is very much a matter of degree, right? So by and large, the proposition that we do not want judicial figures, right, sort of preempting and undoing the work of popularly elected officials. That's by and large an unremarkable proposition, right? As long as it's sort of a matter of degree, right? It's sort of within reason. Right. We also look to courts to engage in oversight, supervision, to keep legislatures and elected officials within kind of the proper bounds. So I just don't know enough about this case to figure out how to balance that. When I do some court stuff at the end of the Supreme Court term and we all come back, I promise I'll have a much better answer. But I'm not. You know, my uninformed views. I'm not that concerned about it, honestly. So yeah, there's a couple other hands, I think, or maybe not. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet.
You mentioned your enthusiasm for local politics.
Yeah.
So I would like to hear your
Oh yeah, here we go.
Your wise insights of local politics. I'm not going to make any claims. I want to hear your.
Sure. I love politics that is closest to us, right? A democracy where where the people in office are responsive, right? I can go down to City Hall and get my one-man protest and stick my sign in the ground, and guess what? Mayor is going to see it when he comes out. Or I need a trust done, and I have my mayor do it, and I can give him a piece of my mind. Darn it. You know, local government does important stuff, right? They teach our children. They keep our communities safe and clean. They keep our economies humming. They provide jobs. This is what local governments do, at least help with, right? And like, I actually feel good about like them them having to listen to me. Right. If I could wave my magic wand, I would do a dramatic sort of rebalancing of federal versus state and local power. I think, right, our emphasis on federal power has made the stakes so high about virtually everything that we can't do anything. And so I'm a big fan of kind of power filtering down. Now I have a much more complicated and nuanced sort of vision of how that happens with federal resources, right? Cooperative federalism, right? None of it is either or. These are not separated, right? They're working in conjunction with each other. But yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with local and state officials. I remember, oh, my dear wife, I love her. When we got married, she was the most apolitical person you could imagine. And then we got married. I had a semester out in Washington, D.C. We didn't have children then, so she decided she was going to come with me, and she got a job on Capitol Hill. And she turned into a political animal. I mean, look out. I mean, you think I'm bad. I stay out of her way when she's on a political rant. But I remember early on in our marriage, I came home from school, and back in the day, you had the old answering machines by the phone. Ours was blinking. And so I pick it up, I play the message, and I can still remember it was either Wayne Kuipers or Joe Haveman calling from the floor of the state legislature in Lansing saying, Jennifer, I got your call or I got your email. I really appreciate it. You know, here's what I think, da, 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 da. Please feel free to give me a call back. That's a good thing. Right? That's a good thing. That's politics that I think is some way responsive. I think it is hard to envision that degree of responsiveness in a real way that is something other than posturing from our elected representatives at the national level. And because they are utterly dysfunctional, what are they doing? What are they doing with the power? They are passing it off, right? So we have government by bureaucracy. That is just the reality. Right? And bureaucracies are about as unaccountable as any kind of institution you can imagine. We have local bureaucracies, but I know how to get at them. Right? So is that convincing at all?
Well, until you get to the top.
The county level. No, I mean, this is a good thing. This is like, how many of you were paying attention to the county commission before this bunch of nut jobs took over? Nobody. Now people are showing up, hours and hours of public commentary. How many of you are now in the next election cycle not going to pay any attention to who's running for the drainage ditch commissioner, right? You're going to be paying attention. This is a good thing. Oh, this is almost an unadulterated good thing. Plus, they are going to get slapped down. So there's the election part of it. And so let me be serious. The election part of it was a mixed blessing. It was a mixed affair. And so on the one hand, they didn't hide anything they were doing, right? If you went to their website, there it was in all its glory. Right? These are the things we believe in. If you're going to run under our banner, these are the things you have to pledge to support. Clear as a bell, clear as a bell. On the one hand. On the other hand, there was a lack of transparency in their willingness to engage the public. So they didn't show up at the League of Women Voters debates. They didn't come to candidate forums. I was teaching my party and elections class. I reached out to them 3 times just because I wanted them to come talk about local political organization, because part of it was masterful. And I wanted my students to be exposed to it. And I never got a response, right? There ought to be some basic foundational commitment to engaging the public if you're going to run for public office. They failed on that. And then the second thing is how they are doing things. These people clearly they do not have someone who's advising them on open meeting laws and such. And it's been a long time since I actually did some municipal work as a lawyer, but I remember enough to think these people are probably in trouble under the Michigan open meeting law. Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, after the first meeting, the take no prisoners meeting, the next time, right? And everything was 9-2. The next meeting, it was 6-5. Right? And even 3 of the wackos, right, had become much more sort of reasonable. Like, am I getting anybody upset yet? Okay. So like representative democracy is kind of playing out. So no, I think this is a good thing, right? And if we don't like them, guess what? We're either going to have a recall or fairly soon we'll be able to vote them out, right? And there are counter groups organizing. In my adult life, we finally have like organizing at the local political level around electoral politics. I love it. Way to go, Auto Impact. Hey, that's the fault of the people who didn't turn out, right? There was some silly column in the Sentinel on mandates, political mandates. Guess what? The people who vote get to claim the mandate, and the people who they voted in. So that's on us, people. Yeah, yes.
With the number of people who seem to be dissatisfied with both the R's and the D's, moving possibly more towards independent, do you foresee a lot more people going towards that, being independent and deciding individual people and looking at the issues and the quality of the person? Or are you expecting a potential third party to really finally get to the level? And how long would that take in terms of maybe in like 3 cycles, a presidential cycle before a third party could really have some hold?
Yeah, good question. So we've got 10 minutes to talk about 2024. I trust you're going to invite me back because we've got a lot of ground to cover. So please. And I told Robert, if I get 150 people to sign up, doggone it, I expect a little more to go into my bank account. So so independents versus partisans, and this is hard to read because if you do surveys, right, where people are asked, well, like, well, how do you declare Democrat, Republican, Independent? Those who declare independent outnumber Republican or Democrat. And you might say, oh, independent's huge, way to go. Where are the centrist candidates? It's misleading because a good chunk of those independents really are closet Republicans, closet Democrats. They consistently lean one way or the other. And yet, there is a significant block of independents, and that candidates and parties are not appealing to them is political malpractice. We have had this change in the philosophy of how we run campaigns. And it has gone from what was always the conventional wisdom in a primary. If you're a Republican, you got to veer conservative to win the primary. And then when it's general election, you got to somehow, without looking too expedient, get back to the middle, because you're not going to win without some centrists and independents. And same for the Democrats, right? This was Bill Clinton. This was the amazing thing about how he could sort of be one thing to a primary audience and then be something. It was just the guy was masterful. He was the model, right? Now we have these base elections, and right, Trump won the presidency because he thread the needle in a way he would never do again. And you would think over 4 years he would have some sliver of interest in trying to broaden his base, right? And trying to win some of those never Trumpers or middle of the roaders, moderate Republicans, people living in the suburbs. He had no interest in it. And so 2020, he runs an election that is all about the base. Democrats do the same thing. No one does it to the degree that Trump does. But I want to see if we can get back to that sort of model. I don't know. Time will tell. On the third party piece, if I were a betting man right now, I would say the odds of President Biden being the Democratic nominee for the presidency in 2024 about 80%. Yes, about 30% of Democrats actually want him. But given how things are playing out, the election, he was the biggest beneficiary of the midterm election. It gave him lots of insulation from targets to take him down, right? He's on a roll now. I don't know how Democrats dislodge him. I don't know how that. I think the man in the best. Okay, now I'm get to rile some more people's feathers. I think the man in the best of times was a remarkably pedestrian politician. He was just the embodiment of the bloviating senator, and he hasn't gotten better as he's gotten long in the tooth. I just don't think he's equipped to really be president in 2024, but I think the Democrats are stuck with him. Trump, it depends on like which side of the bed I get up in the morning. I don't want to be hopeful that he has overstayed his welcome. He's alienated too many people. I said the same thing in 2016 and look what happened. So I don't know. I would say you're right, in my very early unreflective prediction, I think it's probably 30% that Trump will be the nominee. If Trump and Biden are the candidates, so help me, if there is not a serious third party threat, I'm moving. Not like out of the country, I'm moving. I'm moving to Sweden, where my people come from. Or I'm going to go live in Jamaica. I don't care if I have family and kids who are in high school. I'm leaving. That deserves and actually needs a third party challenge. Is there going to be a third party challenge that is going to happen incrementally and built up over the years? No, that's not going to happen. That's not how our system works. There are too many advantages that system structurally, legally, right? The people who make the election laws, i.e. the Republicans and Democrats, guess what? They make the election laws to favor the people who make the election laws, the Republicans and the Democrats. There are too many structural advantages. Right. So you're not going to do it in the normal way, right? And it's winner take all electoral college. You don't build up support from election to election, right? Ross Perot, for getting 20% of the vote, got 0 electoral college votes, and there was nothing that carried him over to 1996 from 1992. So 2 things would have to happen. One would be that the biggest obstacle is getting access to the ballot in 50 states. As I understand it, there are organizations who are working on that now. Okay, and so you can do that as a political party. You can do that, right? You don't have to have drafted a candidate yet. So for the party, you can get access to the ballot. So I know there are a couple of groups who are working on that now. And then depending on what happens, they would draft a candidate who would run under their banner. So ballot access has to happen, and then it would have to be catching lightning in a bottle. It would have to be the right person. And it'd have to be the person with a public profile. It has to be someone from the middle who can challenge both sides. It has to be someone with lots of money or who can raise a ton of money. Those are the things that would have to happen, right? Think of Ross Perot. He got 20% and he was leading well into the summer. He was leading Dolan Clinton until his self-destructive impulse kicked in and he shot himself in the foot and he was a crazy man, right? So it could happen, but it's got to be, it's got to be this unique confluence of events. And even if that's not the case, my picture for a third party is based on a third party candidate not winning, a third party candidate focusing on half a dozen swing states where in 2016 elected Donald Trump, in 2020 elected Joe Biden, assuming the parties are responsive, that you run someone in those states who can do enough to deprive other party of the electoral college in that particular state. That would be my answer. Bob is wildly gesticulating back there.
Well,
So I guess I need to stop.
One final question.
Okay,
And that
yes.
is, are you optimistic about bipartisanship over the next 2 years?
Oh, good Lord, no. That's what we're going out on. No, I do not expect much to get done in the next. So one final story, I did a little conversation with Pete Hoekstra, our former congressman over at Hope College, kind of on the state of the parties. Pete Hoekstra, who was a cranky conservative Dutch Republican, and who, became a member of the Tea Party, came in in 92, was a part of the Gingrich gang. And he reminded me, that some of the most he got done in Congress, he was working with Barney Frank. Remember Barney Frank, as liberal, a gay rep from Massachusetts as you could find, they worked together. Jane Harmon, liberal as the day is long from California, she and Pete worked on, I think, security issues together. They got stuff done, right? Pete Hoekstra, who's pretty darn conservative and pretty Republican. And he talked about Gingrich and Clinton, who in public, it was pretty brutal. In private, they went into the back room, they worked out deals, they got stuff done. And we forget that. And there was incentive for them to get it done. Now it seems like, and this is whoever is in the White House, and Biden has done this, and Trump before him, and Obama before him. This goes back, I think Clinton was the last one, where the opposition party is just the party of no. They are resolved not to help out the president at all. I cannot believe that presidents cannot find ways to make political hay with that, and to find ways that, to create the incentives to work with the opposition party. And there are incentives, but they've given up. They've given up on that idea. I don't know who could turn that around. So I'm not optimistic in the short term, and we'll see what happens after that. Nope, we've got one more here. Oh, thank you. You get a question. Yeah.
No, I'm not going to ask a question of you this time. I'm just going to ask the audience, of whatever nature it may be, to work hard on keeping you in this country in whatever form it takes.
Can I end with a story? So I did like a talk to a competitor organization fairly recently. They pay more than you do. The last question was someone, and they were giving me lots of love. And the last question was, when are you going to run for public office? Yes. And then I said, well, and there was it was 100 people on Zoom. I said, well, how many of you are going to support me? And 3 hands went up. And then I said, and with your money, I don't care about your vote. I want your money. And 2 of the hands came down. So yeah, thanks a lot. So thanks for good conversation. Yeah.